On the second day of our stay in Ooty, one of the two major towns served by the Nilgiri Mountain Railway in southern India, we were given the opportunity during the morning to take a look round the various sites. We left our hotel with its splendid garden and flowers in profusion and magnificently mature trees, and made our way first of all to the hilltop which rises above Ooty itself and is actually a very significant vantage point. From the hilltop viewing area we look down first of all towards Coonoor, which as we now know is some distance from Ooty, but there it appears as though one could reach out and touch it down in the valley. And then as we move around the viewing platform in a moment or two, we look down on Ooty itself from the other side of the hill. This is the view from the other side, looking down towards Ooty. You may have just heard me speaking into the camera microphone there, but just to confirm, we are now looking down at Ooty, sprawling across the valley floor. Leaving the summit of the hill above Ooty, we move down the hill towards a tea gardens, which serves as both a tea factory, tea museum, and actually a working tea garden where tea is picked. And in these pictures we see the young lady engaged in the picking process, picking off the top buds of each new grown plant and transferring them rapidly into a sack. There's the sack there to her left, and now we can actually see her in action. For those of you old enough to remember the old British Morris Oxford, there's just such a car, but they're now produced in India by the Hindustani Motor Corporation and are used extensively as taxis. And this gentleman was very, very proud of his car, and rightly so. We now move into the tea factory, where we can actually see the tea leaf drying process and the processing from the raw leaves, which we see here being placed into a conveyor system, and they will travel partly by moving belts and partly by gravity, to the floor below, where the drying and the tea manufacturing process continues. And on the ground floor we actually see finished tea for sale. So the whole process is visible here, even though I don't claim to have a great understanding of what's involved. We are now one floor below, and these still images show that the tea passes along a series of conveyors and then turns through 90 degrees there to the right, and even further along into what appears to be a drying mechanism. Product still seems to be pretty coarse, so quite clearly there is further stages for it to go through, and this drum does appear to be involved in the drying process, because the tea at the far end of the drum is much more akin to that which we're familiar with at home. And this is the business end of the dryer, and as I said, quite clearly the tea is now being fined down to something which we would recognise as such. And if you want some, I'm sure these staff would be pleased to oblige. Our next stop takes us to what was described, at least in part, as a Tibetan market, even though we're still in southern India. And from there we moved into the Ooty Botanical Gardens. But the market was very interesting, and the array of produce on display served all needs, I guess. And here we are at the entrance to the garden, the ticket office, and Trevor there with his Gloucestershire hat. This is the entrance walkway and the entrance houses, and immediately we can see the fine specimen trees which have been used to enhance the gardens, as well as the cannon there. I didn't record the date of the cannon, perhaps it goes back as far as the 1850s, who knows. And there we are in flowers, Government Botanical Gardens. The gardens were very much a public park, and there were several parties of teachers and their school children charges enjoying the sunshine and the open spaces. This little market stall selling beautiful embroidery was the work of the Toda people, and I brought one of those home as a present for my wife Sandra. Beautiful work. You can see some of it hanging up behind the two ladies there. Further views of the fine specimen trees. Strangely, they looked quite English. That looks like an elm tree. Not that we have many of those still standing in England. And there we have another. Beautiful specimens. And that one quite clearly is very Indian. Outside the gate was some very direct advertising, exhorting people to cease smoking and also to avoid the exploitation of child labour. Now we move on to the calm and serenity of St Stephen's Church in Ooty, a fine building which was consecrated in 1830 and, according to the notice outside, seems to have taken only 1 year to build. The English settlers, I think, were creating a home from home, and they certainly did that in full measure. There we have a view from inside of the church and the various stained glass windows and several interesting memorials. This memorial was to a gentleman who was drowned in the local river whilst out hunting, not on the battlefield. And here is a Geoffrey Heseltine, I wonder, of Michael Heseltine, the government. We weren't granted admission to the Ooty Club headquarters, and photographs were not allowed. So you'll have to take my word for it that it was a splendid looking place with fine porticos at the entrance and very vigilant staff. The gardens were attractive, and most of the flowers, I have to say, are familiar from home gardens and hothouses, but they made a very interesting display. Unfortunately, as I said, our stay was very limited, so we moved on towards Coonoor and the railway station for our second opportunity to travel on the line. These are some brief views from the road as we travelled between Ooty and Coonoor is the town which you can see down in the valley. The now familiar site of the main station building at Coonoor and the entrance yard there. And a carved piece of stonework and notice stating quite clearly that Coonoor Station celebrated its centenary in 1897 to 1997. So here we are, 115 years now since the station was opened. Very imposing offices for the sectioned engineer, permanent way, and the stuffed and mounted engine that we saw on our first film. And the tut-tut cabs, the little Piaggio driven devices, which are used as a very cheap form of transport in the local area. And a view of the engine shed and one of the steam engines, not the one necessarily that's taking us. Again, a familiar sight now. The service train to which our coach was attached for the downward journey is due to arrive diesel hauled from Ooty. And we shall see it in a moment or two. Meanwhile, we admire the blue jacaranda tree on the right hand side there, and here comes our train. But my filming was curtailed somewhat by a railway policeman who said no video, no video. So I abided by his instructions in the interests of discretion. Our coach was finally appointed, and a number of the railway staff, including our familiar brakeman, had a chat to us through the windows of the coach, and then it was attached to the service train that we've just seen arrive. And there's the engineer making the necessary connections. We can see some of the basic controls inside the coach which replicate those on the engine. And here is the quality of the seating and what have you in the coach. It was a very comfortable way of travelling down the line, for which we're very grateful to the Indian Railway and Nilgiri Railway organisation. So 28 kilometres of this wonderful railway are ahead of us now as we set off from Coonoor Station on the down line. Unfortunately, because the locomotive is not working very hard on the descent, the effects of steam and the general noise of the engine working are reduced, but the scenery doesn't alter, and so we can just sit back and enjoy our run through down to the level plains as we approach Mettupalaiyam. On the return trip, we passed through Runnymede Station without stopping, presumably because the locomotive is using less steam on the descent of the line.
Level than 120.
Mist in the valley again obscures the view somewhat, but that's the way it was, and hopefully the sun will break through lower down. sent to the same address?
Yeah.
And these are our two crew members who enabled me such prime access for filming, Mr. Vasudevan and his colleague Mr. Rangaraj. I hope I pronounced those names correctly, but they certainly know who they are and much appreciated their cooperation. Hillgrove Station again now, and the crew members and our small party and the rest of the passengers leave the train whilst the engine takes on water this time round. And for those of us with imperial measure still in our heads, Hillgrove is 3,580 feet above sea level and 18 kilometres from our destination. and the tunnel mouth ahead of us is tunnel number 6, which is some 15 kilometres from our destination. Mr. Ranga Raj still keeps a watchful eye on proceedings. The staff were very attentive on the descent. Their task is equally important. A very definite sense now that the line is levelling out, although technically we are still descending towards the station of Coonoor. And here is Coonoor Station, where there is a crew exchange.
We'll find Zeddy. It's in my ears.
On level grounds now, and we've left the rack assisted section of the line and we're running down the last few kilometres to our destination. The locomotive driver whistles extensively, and I think we can see the reason for that. There was a beast of burden on the line and he seems to have ended with a rather damaged leg.
Yeah, I think
possibly twisted it running in front of the train, but either way he's not going forward as quickly as he was, I guess. Let's hope he can be attended to. The river seems to provide recreation for the youngsters and a very useful source of water for washing for the ladies with greater responsibilities. And finally, back where it all started, what seems like a lifetime ago, but it was only yesterday, and the station is now crowded with the passengers who will go their various ways, and we will return to a car and repeat the journey by road. Not half as exciting as the rail trip, but there we are.
They seem to go through 13 cycles of investing and then doing nothing.
And a final view of the crew and the platform on which they were fulfilling their responsibilities, and a view down the line to the engine shed as everything goes quiet, and a view from this morning or yesterday morning to remind us what it was all like when we started.